It's reported that the first ever licensed credit bureau has now been introduced to Kenya. How does it change the landscape for banking and finance?
Well, it has some considerable change to the whole finance industry. One, previously in this market, there was no bureaus that were available, meaning there was a large chunk of individuals who were actually being left out from accessing credit. With the credit bureau now in place, it means that the commercial banks can actually be able to extend that credit to other sectors which previously they would not address or would not actually attend to.
Obviously, the theme, many would argue, for 2011, regulation, 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 and this really draws us into the whole question of credit risk management, which is key. In Kenya, how pervasive is the problem of defaulters?
In Kenya, the default rate is not that high. We're only looking at about 10% of in the banking industry of defaulters, so it's still relatively low. It's nothing too much to worry about.
Credit profile of consumers and borrowers. I mean, I often use this comparative question. In South Africa, we're told that we're indebted over 70% of our income. What's the situation in Kenya? What's the credit profile of the average consumer?
Well, the average consumer actually is not as highly rated as you would have in South Africa, bearing in mind that this is it's a developing economy, quite way behind South Africa. So the profile for each individual is actually, by the way, you're looking in Kenya at over 50% of the population being below the poverty line. So you're looking at a very small population that actually has collateral or access to funding.
CRB, your footprint is quite extensive in Africa, West, Northern and Southern Africa. How does East Africa compare?
Well, East Africa in the markets that we're in is actually fairly large. The other countries that we're in, Botswana, Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi, as you can imagine, population-wise as well, much smaller to what we have here in Kenya, but fairly similar in terms of the profile of each individual in those markets.
How stringent are regulations in Kenya? I mean, obviously the emphasis now is on rigorous bank checks, for instance, strict application of lending rules to try to also protect the banks from impairments and bad debts.
It's fairly strict across the industry. Well, in Kenya, many of the banks actually adapting to the credit now that the bureau is in, and actually using the reports to actually determine individuals' credibility. So acceptance has been very high. In terms of information that is being held, very limited, considering that it's only negative reporting that is currently mandatory in Kenya. So there's still a gap there in terms of the information that they're getting to be able to make a fair evaluation on an individual.
How do the rules apply to microlenders? Because it's really within this level of finance that we're seeing growth in Kenya.
Now, well, with the microlenders, currently, with the current regulations, which is another problem, well, as you mentioned with the regulations, is that the banking industry is, or the bureaus in Kenya, regulated by the central bank, which only takes care of the banks. Now, the MFIs and the SACCOs are now coming on board, but under a different regulation, which was yet to be effected. So right now, the microlenders that don't have access to the bureau until those regulations are actually passed.
Products and the services that you provide as CRB, I'll tell you that in South Africa, again, the focus these days is on debt counseling, is not to punish those who are defaulting, but to try to help them recover and pay those debts.
Yeah. True, there is that aspect, but what we are trying to push in this market is actually, it's actually a product to help the consumer. Credit in this market is actually fairly high. If the banks are able to fairly assess you on your credibility, they should be able to actually offer you credit at a much lower interest rate. So our focus here is actually to try and protect the consumer.
You talk about interest rates, and obviously that's been a discussion just in terms of macroeconomic and monetary policy in Kenya. For instance, inflation is on the rise, and people are questioning whether or not the CBK should have kept rates unchanged, whether it should be acting towards monetary tightening. The argument from the central bank is we really need a situation where we're stimulating credit flows so that we have more investment in the economy. What's your role in that kind of context then?
I think I agree that one of the crucial things that are needed in a growing economy is you've got to be able to enable the people to spend, and without the spending, you're able to actually increase levels of investments in the country, and also, you know, just make it a much healthier economy with more people actually spending. So I think it's actually very critical for them to, and I'm with them in actually pushing for more spending and actually giving people access to finance to be able to facilitate that spending.
Privacy, it's a big concern because what we do see with the technological revolution is very fast information flows. And so I may apply for a bond at the bank. The bank must check my credit worthiness with the credit bureau, and very quickly all my confidential information is in a system that can be shared amongst banks and other service providers. What have you done to secure data concerning information's credit records? And yeah, how secure is the system?
I mean, the system is very secure, and the central bank here has actually taken on board a very strict and tough guidelines for you to actually meet to be licensed as a credit bureau to ensure that the data is actually safe. As you rightly say, this is personal information which is very sensitive. And again, as I said previously, our aim is to protect that consumer. So we actually do have very sophisticated software that is always tested, consistently tested. Plus, the regulator here, the central bank, do actually have spot audits to actually ensure that the security levels are as we say they are.